Next, we talk to Cinda Edwards, the coroner for Sangamon County. We learn about the role of the coroner's office in performing autopsies and working with the law, as well as some of the office's public outreach programs to prevent fatalities. This runs about 20 minutes.
Cinda Edwards, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thanks for having me.
As the coroner for Sangamon County here in Springfield, you know, so many of us, I think we hear about these titles of offices and the coroners. We think we know what that is, but
Right.
There's so much involved in these offices, and we really often don't know what goes on. So tell us in a broad, but not too long, I mean, just what's the big picture? What is it that a coroner does, and why do we have a coroner's office?
Well, the coroner is responsible for death investigation, and any death that is of unusual circumstances, seems to be non-natural, due to violence, automobile accidents, so, and also people that are not under the care of a physician. So we do investigations into those deaths, and our job is to determine cause and manner of death.
And now, one other thing I know that you bring to the office is you have a medical background.
Right.
You're a nurse, I think?
I've been a nurse since 1979.
Your predecessor didn't have a medical background, and in fact, a lot of coroners around the state. And I guess every county has their own coroner. Is that how it works?
Right. Illinois has coroners in almost every county, and then the Cook County is a medical examiner system.
For the coroner's office and the different counties, does it matter that the coroner has a medical background?
Well, it's not required. The only thing required to be a coroner is to have the people elect you, because it's an elected office. So technically you don't need any certification or educational requirements to be coroner. You just need to have the public elect you and convince them that you can do the job.
But from a practical standpoint, from doing the job, I mean,
Right.
Is it better to have a medical background, and if so, why?
Well, I think it's very useful to have a medical background because you're determining cause of death, and as we know, death is usually the result of some sort of medical process. So.
Now, I know we talked before we did the interview right here, just so I could get a little background. So you're going to have in Sangamon County, if I'm right, over the course of the year, you would have approximately, about 170 to 200 deaths in the county so far? Is that,
Oh, no,
that come through your office?
No, our office is probably notified of 2,400 deaths per year. Now, a lot of those reports come from the hospital or nursing homes, and they end up not being coroner's cases. So they report the death, and we determine, no, it's not a coroner's case.
What would constitute a coroner's case?
Anyone that's been in the hospital less than 24 hours, anyone who's...
So if they go in with chest pains and die of a heart attack, then it becomes a coroner's case?
It becomes necessary for the hospital to notify the coroner's office.
I see.
So it's kind of complicated, but
so
the coroner then makes the decision, is that going to be a coroner's case? So what we might check is if the person came in and was in the hospital less than 24 hours, did they have a medical history that supports that they may have, that they would pass away, that it would not be unusual for them to pass away.
So in certain cases you investigate, in other cases you don't.
Right. Well, we'll take the medical information from the caller, and then based on what they say, or sometimes additionally we'll look up records and then get back to them, determine whether it's going to be a coroner's case or not. And sometimes it's a coroner's case, but that doesn't necessarily mean there'll be an autopsy. So anybody that's had a fall with a significant injury or fracture in the last 13 months, that's a coroner's case.
And die from it, obviously.
Well, they died, not necessarily from the injury, but let's say you broke your hip 8 months ago and you pass away, you're automatically going to be a coroner's case, because we need to investigate that death to see if the fall or fracture caused the death, because then that would make it an accidental death versus natural.
When you what determines whether you're going to have an autopsy done, number one, and number two, let's answer number two first. Who does, since we have the coroners, as we already established, don't necessarily even have a medical background thing, who does the autopsies for the coroners?
Well, a pathologist, and in most cases, it's a forensic pathologist. Some coroners have some pathologists who are not board certified forensic pathologists that do all their exams or some of their exams. But in our case, we use a forensic board certified pathologist.
And who pays for those that autopsy?
The taxpayer.
And then when your autopsies that are done in a variety of circumstances. Probably a small minority of those might be either they were a murder,
Right.
or they causes unknown where it might have been a murder.
Right. So homicides are a very small part of the number of autopsies we do. Obviously, if there's a homicide or suspected homicide, we're going to do an autopsy in every case. Hands down, and they're going to get an autopsy. Most of the time, if you're in an automobile accident and you get killed in an automobile accident, we're going to do an autopsy. And with each autopsy, we do complete toxicology panel as well, standard, everyone. It's consistent across the board that way.
And so when you're working on the homicides, those are always kind of interesting. At least that's one of the few times when we probably have heard about the coroners on watching
Right.
a TV
Right.
show like the Jack Klugman show, was
Right,
it Quincy?
right,
You know.
yeah.
When you do that, who determines if it's a murder? Maybe it's obvious, but how do you work with, let's say, the county prosecuting attorney as far as the gathering of evidence, and if he's going to bring something to trial, and how
Right,
does that all work?
so when there's a homicide, we're working with the local police authority, whoever it may be, and they usually also attend our autopsies. And if it's a gunshot wound, for example, we may be retrieving bullets from the body, and the police would take possession of those, and we collaborate with each other and work to see if we can help them solve who was the person who did the homicide, but it's a joint effort.
Do you have cases where it remains undetermined? I'm thinking of the famous Drew Peterson case from Northern Illinois, where I think it was
Right, exactly. Well, bathtub, it turns out, water and water deaths are difficult to investigate and prove. And so I think his was, they determined that he had drowned his wife in the bathtub. And those.
then here she was buried, and they finally exhumed her at
Right,
some point.
exactly. I don't know how they determined in exhuming her that, that it was indeed a homicide. I don't know. I'm not privy to the details. But yeah, sometimes things that look like they may be a natural death or possibly a suicide, you have to make sure that those aren't indeed a homicide.
How many cases do you come across as just a rough approximation to where you can't determine? I mean, it's a suspicious death, but you really can't determine whether it's a homicide or not. And who makes the judgment call as far as does it proceed to being investigated further?
Well, our determination of homicide, I would rely some on the police reports, and we would put everything together. Usually a homicide is evident. They used to always have coroner's inquests, which I believe 2007 is when they determined that they were not legally required anymore. Most coroners do not do an inquest, but an inquest was to determine the manner of death, and so you would put your evidence and call a few people in to testify and have the jury come up with manner of death. But usually the manner of death is fairly evident, if someone has a stab wound. But we always do, if somebody, for instance, does commit suicide with a gunshot, wound, then we always do an autopsy. We need to make sure, is it plausible, the angle of the wound and how they did it, is that all consistent with suicide, or did somebody stage it and possibly somebody else shot the person and then staged it as a suicide? So.
And how long have you been the coroner?
3 years.
3 years. What, every time you go into some job, you learn something you didn't know about or didn't expect. Was there anything that kind of surprised you about this?
Well,
thing?
yeah, there were a few things that really surprised me. The number of suicides. I believe last year we had 36 suicides, and people don't really hear about them, but there's an awful lot of them, and it's very sad. Also, the number of overdose deaths.
Are they going up or not? And what I'm getting, I in a different story we're working on about the proliferation of drugs and things like heroin. Is there any causation there that you can see?
Opiate addiction period is huge. There's a large number of people that are addicted to opiates, and it goes across every economical level and social level. Heroin is an opiate. And so sometimes people get started with prescription drugs, painkillers, and their addiction goes that way. And then, we have had fewer deaths. This year, 2012, was a big year for opiate-related deaths. Last year was a little bit down. I know that some of the addiction clinics are training people to give Narcan if they have a loved one that is an addict, or if they're, an addict and are around other addicts, Narcan can block the effects of the opiates, so hopefully prevent death if someone does overdose. So I don't know, maybe the numbers are down because that's being used, I'm not sure, but we still see it.
When you, let's talk about just funding, and when we talk about government, it seems now you're funded by the county government, but
right.
Government, it seems like at any number of levels, is struggling. How about funding? And you talk to your other coroners, I guess, around the state. You probably have some annual meetings or something where you touch base.
Right.
How is, generally speaking, are coroners' offices adequately funded?
Well, probably not. Well, I don't know if we want to say adequate. It's a struggle. We stretch our money as far as we can. The autopsy line is a big budget buster for most coroners. But
line in the budget.
Yeah.
How much does it cost to do an autopsy?
Well, I would say around, it depends. My cost, I always figure around $1,800 to $2,000.
Per
autopsy, mm-hmm. Right. By the time you consider all of the pathologist fee, the autopsy suite fees, the lab fees, and everything involved, so.
And just here in Sangamon County, which is obviously not the biggest of counties, but probably moderately sized, I guess.
Right.
How many autopsies would be conducted in the course of a year?
I do about 165. You have one opportunity.
So they're looking at north of 300,000 just on the
Right.
autopsies.
Right, but you have to weigh very carefully if you're going to do one, because you only have one opportunity to do it. And in the case like with Drew Peterson, if you have to exhume a body to do it, it's very expensive. So I like to err on the side of caution, and if I think that we need one, I try to put cost aside. I'm always mindful of the cost, but I don't let that be my determining factor. If I think we need an autopsy, I order it.
Speaking of also talking with other coroners, are there other issues relative to, are you guys regulated by the state, or who actually sets up the operating?
It's by state.
Are there any issues that, as an association, you are going to the legislature? Are you overregulated? Are you trying to get some laws changed or anything that we would know about that you would talk about with them?
Well, we always.
And I know you're not the head of the association.
Yeah, exactly. And there's every once in a while. I mean, we have a lobbyist, and every once in a while somebody comes up with a rule they'd like to put in that affects the coroners, but you don't realize that it won't work. And really, the coroner is a separate eye or investigation for death. That's what we do, is we investigate death. Other law enforcement agencies have all sorts of crime and all sorts of things to investigate, but ours is an independent review of a death, and I feel that's very important.
And then just lastly, when you have a body, and sometimes it's undetermined cause of death, and it might have been a murder, how long can you, generally speaking, hold on to the body to do the investigation? Because you're going to have a family that wants to bury their loved one.
Once we do the autopsy, then the body can be buried or cremated. We can continue our investigation. But unless the family wants to order us, get a second independent autopsy, pretty much when we're done with our autopsy, we have all the information we can glean from the body.
Do you ever have a family that says, for religious purposes, I don't want to have an autopsy done?
I have not run across that, but I think that has probably happened to other coroners. Legally speaking, if the coroner determines there needs to be an autopsy, then there's going to be one done. Because, of course, somebody could commit murder and then say, well, they oppose an autopsy because of religious purposes to hide a murder. So you just can't have that. So.
Is there anything I haven't asked you that I should?
Well, we have several ways that we're notified of death. The hospital, the nursing home, police department. People are found in their home and they've passed away. And a lot of times it'll be people that don't have any family and nobody's checking on them, or they're estranged from their family, or they have mental illness. And sometimes it may be a week or two that they're in the home and nobody realizes they've passed away. So we see a lot of that. We get a lot of people that pass away at home, and we make a lot of calls to the home. We also go to the emergency room.
Typically elderly, I would guess, huh?
We get a lot of people in their 50s, which I don't think is so elderly.
I don't either.
I've been noticing that
young.
lately. I'm like, a lot of people born in the same decade as I. So.
It's kind of sad, I guess, but anyone would die and wouldn't be noticed.
I know, it is. It's very sad. And another issue that was surprising to me when we were talking about surprising issues is the issue of co-sleeping. And I know that they're doing a push for safe sleep, but
I'm sorry, what?
Co-sleeping, so infants co-sleeping with a parent or other family members. And so a young infant, if the parent is overly tired or perhaps intoxicated or in a deeper sleep for some reason,
and they have an infant
and it's an overlay, and the infant, ultimately is smothered. We always.
Is that common?
Yeah, it happens more often than you'd think, and it's very upsetting, of course, for the parent. It's upsetting for everybody involved, and we always go to the home the next day or that day even with a doll and do a recreation. But I know there is going to be a big push for safe sleep to encourage people not to co-sleep like that.
And then last question I was going to say, is there anything that from what you learn, maybe like this example, where you do any kind of public outreach and you say from an educational standpoint, here's stuff maybe you shouldn't be doing?
Right, and exactly. This safe sleep is something, and we always participate as well in presentations at school for prom, and no drinking and driving, and also texting or cell phone usage while driving. So we do a lot of outreach that way.
Have you had many cases?
I think that those programs that they're putting on for prom I think they work, because we really haven't had around prom time or anything, any teen fatalities, knock on wood, to speak of since I've been coroner. So it's very interesting to go to one of those. The kids really pay attention. I think it really gets their notice. They do this. The local fire departments and everybody that's involved that puts it on, they do a really good job. The makeup and everything, and the kids, you can just see that they really take it to heart.
All right. Well, Cinda Edwards, thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Absolutely. I hope I've cleared up the coroner system just a little bit for you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.